Tonight on Cross Currents, Disciples of Chaos. A sinister new breed of right-wing extremists has emerged in Britain. Their leaders are educated, persuasive, and committed, but they're terrorists, and their goal is the overthrow of the British state. Cross Currents with Jim Carney.
There's something quite incongruous in the idea of Nazis and Canada. I mean, this is a large, expansive, gentle, tolerant country. The rigid, fanatic character of Nazism just seems so at odds with the nature of Canada and Canadians that, well, it just couldn't happen. It's surprising then to learn that Canada does have a small but continuing extreme right wing driven by a handful of people, some of whom have been around for decades. It's not something we like to talk about, but tonight we're going to talk about it because ultimately it helps us understand what this country is all about and the principles and values it stands for. Tonight's film, Disciples of Chaos, is not about Canada. It was produced in England, and it looks at the activities of a small group of neo-Nazis or neo-fascists in London, many of them young, some of them skinheads. Now, England has long had an extreme right wing. It also has a long history of disaffected youth prone to violence, as exemplified so frighteningly in Anthony Burgess's book Clockwork Orange, published in 1962. In more recent years, partly as a result of immigration, Britain has experienced high levels of racial tension and conflict. But Disciples of Chaos describes a new and frightening dimension, how this explosive mix of alienated, hostile youth, racism, and extreme right-wing politics is moving underground and adopting the attitudes, organizational methods, and techniques of terrorist groups in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Now, what could this possibly have to do with Canada? Hopefully nothing. But let's take a hard look at ourselves. Canada is going to have to accept more immigrants. Why? First, because there is enormous pressure from outside, particularly from the third world, where 3 out of 4 people simply cannot survive where they are. Secondly, because this country's labor force, if left to itself, will begin to decline in numbers and productivity, gradually weakening our ability to compete internationally. Even in the face of these facts, the idea of increased immigration is an anathema to many Canadians. There is also a significant tradition of racism in Canada, much of it religion-driven, based on the idea of protecting Christian values and a Christian way of life. This easily translates into protecting the traditions and values of a white society, as we see in South Africa today. In Canada in the 1920s, there were 3 separate national Ku Klux Klan organizations. In the 1930s in Quebec, we had Adrien Arcand and his Parti National Social Chrétien, loudly supportive of Hitler and the Nazis. About the same time, in heavily German-populated areas of Ontario, the Brown Shirt Party and the Deutscher Bund, or German League, appeared. In recent decades, there has been an explosion of extreme right-wing groups in Canada. In his book, Is God a Racist? The Right Wing in Canada, published in 1987, Professor Stanley Barrett of the University of Guelph identifies 161 right-wing groups in Canada, 130 of them formed since World War II. Professor Barrett characterizes 79 of them as radical, that is, as believing in violence. What do such groups believe? What do they have in common? Well, they are all dedicated to the preservation of Christian values and a white society. They are anti-communist, anti-black, and viciously anti-Semitic. Many insist that the Holocaust, Hitler's attempt to eliminate the Jews, never happened, that the Jews control the world's banking and financial systems, that Jews are communists, and vice versa. Typically, they oppose welfare, foreign aid, immigration, homosexuality, and abortion. Many believe that a bloody interracial war, a war to the death between white Christians and Jews, blacks, and other mongrel peoples is imminent, and they're preparing to take to the streets fully armed at a moment's notice. Sound far-fetched? Listen to this. Hayden Lake, Idaho is the headquarters of a major right-wing organization called Aryan Nations, led by 70-year-old Reverend Richard Gerndt Butler, a devotee of the Church of Jesus Christ Christian. These people believe that a Zionist occupational government, or ZOG, has taken over in Washington, D.C., and as this government is illegal, anyone who obeys U.S. law is a traitor. Their goal is to establish in the states of Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, Washington, and Oregon a new genetically pure, whites-only, self-governing republic from which they will wage war against the ZOG government and the blacks, Jews, and all other mud peoples in the U.S. In the early 1980s, Aryan Nations began to recruit members from among U.S. penitentiary inmates. A group of about 30 was formed, calling itself the Bruderschweigen, meaning silent brotherhood, or more commonly, the Order. During 1982 and 83, this group went on a rampage of bombings, hostage-taking, armed robberies, and assassinations throughout the western states. They planned to assassinate Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, one of the Rothschilds, and to blow up a large hydro dam near the Canadian border. By 1985, about 12 people had been murdered and $4 million stolen, most of it never recovered. Eventually, about 24 people went to jail. Their leader, Robert Matthews, died in the flames of a summer cottage on Whidbey Island, not far from Vancouver, as police moved in December 1984. This is not fiction. It happened. In Canada, there are laws against inciting racial hatred, but prosecution can be difficult. Many civil liberties groups oppose prosecution on the principle of free speech. Others feel that prosecution breeds publicity, exactly what the racists want. The racists, of course, insist on their freedom of speech, though much less inclined to grant that same right to their victims. Tonight's film, Disciples of Chaos, describes a new direction in extreme right-wing activities in Britain. As you watch this film, ask yourself, could it happen here?
Chelsea, London. An unlikely setting for the secret headquarters of what was once Britain's leading right-wing party, the National Front. This is also the home of the man who today leads the front.
This is the contact line. Please leave your name, address, and a message after the tone.
Patrick Harrington first hit the headlines in 1984 as a student at North London Polytechnic. Staff and students tried unsuccessfully to ban him from the college because of his National Front activities. Now he has control of the front nationally.
Well, I think the major influence was the fact that a youthful element within the National Front took over the leadership of the National Front completely in about 1986. And we felt that the way things had been done in the past under previous leaderships had been wrong, that no ideology had been clearly defined, and that basically the National Front was a pressure group purely based on the issue of race.
They're developing a series of key ideas which really have moved away from the 1970s type of National Front, which tended to be based either on a racist extreme conservatism or a covert Hitler worship. It's based on fanatical commitment, a sense of sacrifice, and in particular a belief that violence is cathartic, that one actually changes human nature by engaging in violent activities.
See, they have a, well, almost a cliche which they constantly quote. Out of the ashes, the phoenix will rise. Now, phoenix is National Socialism. The ashes have to be created. The ashes are the ruins of our society. In that sense, of course, they're disciples of chaos.
For 20 years, the National Front was a party of protest and confrontation. Stirring up race hate often provoked violence and injury. But it was a party, aiming ultimately, if unsuccessfully, for seats in Parliament. Leaders like Martin Webster and John Tyndall made the headlines then.
Just ignore them, just ignore them.
They say that they'll stop us in London in 2 weeks' time. We will keep marching on, and they will stop us!
But the rhetoric and the marching led only to disaster at the polls.
Yes, we abandoned large-scale demonstrations because we felt they were counterproductive in that they provoked opposition to our policies rather than gaining support for them. And we are now following instead a policy of trying to persuade people that our ideas are right in a behind-the-scenes and low-profile kind of way.
So low is that profile, according to former Nazi activist Ray Hill, that the National Front now qualifies as an underground organisation.
The National Front now is far, far more dangerous, a far more dangerous animal than it was when I was in it, and in my considered view, a far more dangerous animal than it was in 1976 when they were marching through the streets of London with 10,000 people behind them. Far more dangerous.
The National Front is approaching the point at which it really can be considered as a subversive organisation. One can see this simply by looking at its own literature. For example, this year it's issued a series of pamphlets which have included advice on how to resist interrogation by the police. It has given very serious advice on how to set up these secretive cells, avoid penetration, on how to collect information on political adversaries and so on. If one looks at some of its leaflets and pamphlets, one's seeing specific calls to arms, calls to violence. One really is reaching a point at which it isn't simply a question of freedom of speech. One's criticising the fundamental basis of the state. One's seeing implicit or even overtly a call to arms, a total rejection of society as we know it.
These revolutionary policies appear to take the National Front out of legitimate politics and into the shadowy area of subversion. 3 years ago, the then Home Secretary Leon Britton spelt out the definition of subversion in the Commons.
I remind the House that subversion is defined as activities which threaten the safety or well-being of the state and which are intended to undermine or overthrow parliamentary democracy by political, industrial or violent means.
Well, we view the state as subversive in that we believe that it does not represent the interests of the nation. And what we're interested in is the nation, not the state. The state is the servant of the nation, and it is not for the state to tell the nation how to run its affairs or what it should be interested in. And really, we view it as an award that the state views us in that way, as it's fundamentally corrupt. And we are pleased that they view us as an enemy, because if they did not, we would regard it as us doing something wrong. We don't believe in Parliament. We don't call ourselves a political party, we call ourselves a political movement. We would like to see a system whereby power comes up from the grassroots through local councils, and which are elected by the people, and you have a system where those local councils then elect delegates, and Parliament becomes a system of delegates, if you like, a national council of delegates delegated to do specific things, and they can be recalled and sacked at any time.
Can you give us an example of a country where this works?
Yes, this works in Libya.
Statements like this have alienated many senior National Front members. They have been unwilling to embrace the new orthodoxy, preferring the traditional marches and rallies. 2 years ago, former National Front chairman Martin Wingfield and his followers were purged for their dissent. He now leads a rival group. But the official National Front has been taken off the streets by its new, well-educated leadership.
Britain declares war on those who declare war on Britain. Thank you.
Patrick Harrington is the full-time salaried chairman. Graham Williamson, his deputy, controls administration. Legal officer Mark Alder works for a London bank. Cambridge graduate Nick Griffin developed the movement's computerised network. Derek Holland has a degree in history and is the Front's international linkman. Under these 5 men, marching skinheads have been replaced by dedicated activists. It is impossible to join the Front. Membership has become an expensive privilege, open only to a selected few. Those chosen undergo a 3-year cadre training and swear a solemn oath.
I solemnly undertake to give the whole of my secular political loyalty to the National Front.
After signing the oath, new cadres must study set texts. Colonel Gaddafi's Green Book is one of 4 main set books, together with Derek Holland's The Political Soldier. Cadres are subsequently tested on their understanding of the books.
Never in the history of Europe has the need for battalions of political soldiers been so urgent, so vital.
This army fights to win, but if defeat is to be the verdict of destiny, then it will be a battle to the last man, sword in hand.
It is people like you, the readers of this pamphlet, who are going to have to lead the way, to become the political soldiers that will make victory possible.
The political soldier, whose job was to infiltrate, subvert, train for military confrontation if necessary, train for terrorism, get the members into the armed services, make alliances with extremists in Ireland, and so on and so forth. And this Mr. Holland and his group are doing quite effectively at this moment in time. They are political soldiers. They have no hope nor ambition to succeed at the ballot box.
In the short run, the main objective of the political soldiers appears to be to recruit a set of hardcore political activists, this new cadre dedicated to the idea of violence, to the birth of a new spiritual man. In the long run, I think we're seeing a much broader perspective. In particular, the political soldiers seem to view a Britain in which there will be 25 or 30% of people in a subclass, people who don't own their own homes, don't inherit money from parents who own their own homes. This will be people who are not part of Margaret Thatcher's property-owning democracy. This will be the new revolutionary bedrock.
To attract and then re-educate this dispossessed generation, National Front publications are steeped in violent images drawn from medieval mythology. Heroic warrior knights riding through fields of bones. Revolutionary crusaders fighting a holy war. And new images of urban terrorists masked and menacing. The new tradition is one of blood and sacrifice.
And this is the difference. You see, in those days, 5 years ago, it would have been unthinkable to have a headline like that, as they've got on the literature today, a call to arms, a call to sacrifice. Now, I know the individuals who have coined these phrases. They are the wild men of the early 80s.
It's a figurative phrase, just as politicians talk about, Margaret Thatcher talks about smashing the IRA, or she talks about fighting communism. I'm sure that when she talks about fighting communism, she doesn't mean that she's going to go out on the streets and attack people who hold that opinion.
But this publication is far from figurative. It's an official National Front training manual, giving detailed advice on resisting police interrogation and which improvised weapons to carry when selling front literature.
These could include such things as a bunch of keys on a chain. Make sure that you can explain what they are all used for if asked by the police. You should say nothing except for the simple sentences, "I am innocent. I know nothing about any crime or terrorist act. And I know no one involved in any crime or terrorist acts."
Like Patrick Harrington's London base, front regional offices are hard to locate. But there are many of them. Most hide behind post office box numbers, the first of several security barriers designed to protect them from scrutiny. Telephone answering machines provide a second line of defense.
Hello, this is an answering device. You have 30 seconds to leave your message after the beep.
This answer phone technique allows the front ample time to screen all those who try to contact its offices.
This is the Northeast Regional Contact Line. Please leave your name, your address, and if possible your telephone number with your message. Please speak.
The The only public face of the front in the entire United Kingdom is here in East Belfast. A bookshop boarded, bolted, and rarely open.
This is the contact line of Ulster National Front, a movement dedicated to the independence of Ulster. Would you please leave your name, address, and if possible, your telephone number after the tones that follow.
The National Front presence in Ulster disturbs Brian Feeney, an SDLP councillor. He fears the front has found a fertile recruiting ground in its divided cities.
Well, they've been after young people on the loyalist side, the sort of people who would have joined the UDA or the UVF in the past. They're also targeting young people who've become dissatisfied with what they would call lack of military action by the loyalist paramilitaries. They've been trying to take over people who have begun to become dissatisfied with lack of action against the Anglo-Irish Agreement. Young men who are members of loyalist bands, what we call Kick the Pope bands here, who traditionally would have been members of the UDA, they are now the targets for the National Front.
In Ulster, the front feeds these disaffected loyalists with the sectarian rhetoric of the Belfast streets. But the leadership in London is caught in a dilemma. Fanatical nationalism has proved a successful strategy for the IRA, and Patrick Harrington can't bring himself to condemn the terrorists.
Well, I don't use the word terrorist. Even though I disagree with the IRA, I wouldn't use the word terrorist because I think that's media talk, basically, and the talk of hypocritical politicians.
Why?
Because terrorists are people who attack, as a matter of policy, civilians. And that is not the case with the IRA. Although I disagree with their aims, I can see that that is not, at present, their policy.
This picture of Holland and Griffin, taken in Tripoli just 10 days ago by Patrick Harrington, may provide a clue to the source of their Irish dilemma. Colonel Gaddafi is recognised as paymaster and chief armourer to the IRA and other international terrorists. And National Front publications reveal an increasing admiration for and allegiance to the Libyan regime.
We have consistently praised his views and his policies because we think that they are right. We find that people often condemn Colonel Gaddafi without understanding his ideas. However, our experience with the media has led us to find out things for ourselves.
Jim Campbell is one of Ireland's leading journalists. He views the National Front involvement in Ulster as an ever-growing threat.
What I think the National Front are trying to do in Northern Ireland is recruit lots of young people, young militants, to their cause. I think they're trying to infiltrate Protestant paramilitary organisations so that they can influence their thinking. And I think that they intend to use Northern Ireland, or they are conspiring to use Northern Ireland as a springboard for right-wing revolt in other parts of Europe. But certainly National Front members have been involved in violence in Northern Ireland.
Belfast, April 1986. This house, the home of a retired RUC officer, was firebombed. He escaped, but his house was gutted. Belfast teacher Andrew McClory, the Front's Ulster treasurer, was jailed for 2 years for the bombing. But the Front's reaction was to praise McClory as a prisoner of war, rather than condemn him as a terrorist. Within weeks, its monthly journal Nationalism Today devoted 2 full pages to McClory and called for the tearing down of the British state. The National Front also has a policy of naming its critics in its publications. Jim Campbell found his name included on a blacklist in Bulldog.
As a result of the piece appearing, and within just a matter of days, there was an assassination attempt on me. 2 people came to my home in North Belfast. They asked for me by name. When my wife answered the door, I went to the door. One of them produced a pistol and fired several shots, 2 of which hit me in the stomach. I was rushed to hospital. I was technically dead on arrival at hospital for some minutes, but the surgeons there managed to revive me, and I survived the attack. I still have a bullet in my spine.
The Front's reaction was to gloat and pillory the wounded Campbell as the first journalist to be shot during the Troubles. And it left a sinister warning: beware the curse of Bulldog. This is Hell's Hole, a remote area of farmland on the Derry coast. This is where UDA paramilitaries have undergone regular survival training. So seriously do the security forces view links between loyalist extremists and the National Front that responsibility for monitoring the front has passed from Special Branch to MI5. And already security sources report that front members have joined UDA training here when the farmer is away.
You cannot exist in Northern Ireland politics without, to a certain extent, being associated with paramilitary groups, because the fact of the matter is that they exist in large numbers, and if you are active politically in that area, you cannot ignore their existence.
I've always seen the National Front as a sinister organisation, much more than local politicians on either side do. They tend to dismiss it as some sort of lunatic right-wing front organisation that really doesn't have much power and therefore can't influence events. Their propaganda publications are far better printed, far better designed, and of a higher quality than anything is being produced on the loyalist side at the moment. What puzzles a lot of observers is where they get the money to produce this type of material. Certainly that money could not be generated in Northern Ireland. It must be coming in from somewhere else.
Carnaby Street in London's West End. The pubs and shops here have become a world centre for the skinhead movement. Specialist shops sell neo-Nazi merchandise unavailable or illegal elsewhere. Sales of these records, T-shirts, posters and badges generate cash that has financed front propaganda. Behind the songs and the slogans is White Noise, the front's music arm, churning out crude hymns of race hatred. White power is the message, power achieved through hatred and violence. But last year, some white noise bands broke away from the front in a row over money.
None of the actual National Front leaders at that time did any of the work towards white noise. They left it to the people involved in the bands, but they just pocketed all the money. Now we, in the bands, actually in the end got a little bit fed up of it, because what was meant to be happening, the money made by White Noise Records, was meant to go to bring out more records and bring more nationalist groups into the actual recording studios and get out material. But in the end, the National Front leaders, which were the two that actually had control, which was Patrick Harrington and Derek Holland, they actually were using the money more for the political side of things, which was National Front News and Nationalism Today, their magazine.
If the front wanted the skinheads' money, it didn't want them as recruits. These are street fighters, cannon fodder to the front, not its clean-cut young cadre members to be trained in the politics of revolution. In 1988, in the hills above Offa's Dyke on the Welsh border, a remote farmhouse has been renovated. From here, Nick Griffin directs the National Front's newest campaign, Radical Welsh Nationalism, and controls the intake of future cadre members. We have obtained the National Front's most closely guarded secret, the Directorate's own list of cadre members. These names, 120 men and women, represent the movement's elite core of political soldiers. When fully qualified, they will go on to train the next generation of recruits. A few trusted graduates will be chosen to infiltrate the front's political opponents.
I would point out that we're interested in political activity, not in paramilitary violence. The thing is that we believe we can achieve what we want through political activity, and we see no reason for going outside the law. And in fact, if you look at it, it's never been alleged in conspiracy or any legal way that the National Front leadership has condoned violent activity. And I have no convictions for violence, and I would say that there is no one in our present leadership who does have.
At best, Patrick Harrington is being economical with the truth. He himself has a criminal conviction for public order violations. And one rank below the Directorate, National Front organisers and officials have a long history of criminal violence.
James Fennessy, full-time official, assault, guilty. Colin Todd, full-time organiser, possession of an offensive weapon and assault, guilty. David Probert, Oldham branch organiser, criminal damage, guilty. Phil Andrews, West London organiser, assault on the police, guilty. Kevin Turner, full-time organiser, malicious wounding, guilty.
Of all the National Front leadership, Derek Holland has earned the strongest reputation for his fanatical beliefs.
Can you imagine, in this day and age, a man who argues, seriously, means it, that the Spanish Inquisition was the Christian Church's last great effort to rid itself of the pernicious Jew, and were well overdue another Inquisition? He openly encouraged Paki bashing, as he described it. He openly advocated this policy of tension. His objective was to create a race riot, you see. And if somebody ends up in jail, well, too bad. If one of his own followers, one of his own supporters, skinhead, young, white, working class, ends up in jail, it means nothing to Mr. Holland. It means nothing at all. These people are cannon fodder to him, and to Mr. Harrington and his kind.
While Holland and Harrington took charge at home, Nick Griffin looked abroad. He has been responsible for perhaps the most sinister shift in National Front policy.
During the early 1980s, sections of the National Front began to develop strong links with certain Italian terrorists who'd come to live in Britain to escape justice in Italy. In particular, people like Roberto Fiore, people associated with the so-called third position. And the third position tended to stress a new form of ideology, and based on rural, ecological, small units. It tended to be very critical of the old type of fascism, admiring Hitler, the strong state, and so on.
Roberto Fiore is in exile in London. He faces a 6-year jail sentence in Italy for organising an armed group. For many months, he shared this Pimlico flat with Nick Griffin.
Of course, there has been, since 1980, a safe housing policy amongst British Nazis under the auspices of an umbrella organisation called the League of St. George, which created a deliberate liaison with Italians such as Fiore and brought them over here. Fiore was sheltered, he was given food, accommodation, looked after economically, and is probably one of the main influences on the thinking of the National Front today.
Roberto Fiore is also wanted here in Bologna, Italy. Investigating magistrates want to talk to him. They believe he could give crucial evidence about Europe's worst ever terrorist outrage. At 10:25 on the morning of the 2nd of August 1980, the lives of the people in this ancient city were shattered. 86 men, women and children died when a terrorist bomb exploded in the railway station waiting room. 200 others were injured. Every year, thousands of people come from all corners of the world to join the people of Bologna and pay tribute to those who died. 13 men and women have been convicted for their part in the Bologna massacre, but others escaped. Prosecution lawyers believe Roberto Fiore could help bring them to justice.
Roberto Fiore, come dire, non è imputato.
Roberto Fiore was not charged in our courts, so we couldn't interrogate him or accuse him. But certainly Fiore could have told us things of great relevance and importance.
2 young British graduates, Catherine Mitchell and John Kolpensky, died at Bologna. For their families, the pain is deepened by the fact that some of those responsible are still at large. They, like Bologna's mayor, want greater cooperation in fighting terrorism.
I governi europei che dichiarano continuamente di avere tra i loro primi obiettivi.
I can say this. European governments who say their first objective is to combat terrorism should be able to respond when another country requests extradition. Their courts should be able to grant extradition, not to refuse it.
Certainly, because the guilty are not being adequately punished, even though they've been sentenced, the punishment doesn't fit the crime. And the fact that there are terrorists living, working and breathing freely in UK adds to the burden of the death.
Roberto Fiore is not wanted for the Bologna bombing, but he can help to bring to justice those who still are. 4 years ago, Italian courts failed to extradite him. Even though he's a known terrorist, he is free to run 3 businesses in central London, finding jobs and accommodation for Italians and Spaniards.
Hi. I'm from Channel 4 Television, Mr. Fiore.
Okay, bye-bye.
Hi.
Do you mind...
It is well known by the National Front Directorate and Patrick Harrington that Fiore and many other Italian exiles are convicted criminals.
Nonetheless, we do not believe that they are terrorists.
Are you telling me the National Front is better able to judge that than the Italian court?
Well, we believe we are, yes.
On what grounds?
Well, we believe we're able to judge it because we're able to judge any political event throughout the world on the basis of the information we have.
But you have supported, helped and done business with Roberto Fiore.
Well, I don't think we've done business with him.
Is it not the case that he was involved in the magazine Rising? Is it not the case that he was involved in heritage tours with your directorate member?
Well, when you say we have been involved in business with him, do you mean that he has a personal friendship with people in the leadership of the National Front? Is that what you're saying?
Is it not the case that he was involved in the magazine Rising?
Well, I don't know.
Is it not the case that he was involved in heritage tours with Nick Griffin, who's a directorate member?
Yes, he may well have been.
Is it not the case that your publications have published fulsome articles in praise of him and defending him despite the fact that he has a conviction for terrorist offences?
Well, it's a strange kind of conviction which has been cut from 9 years on appeal to 6 years. And I'd ask people this, do they really believe that a terrorist would receive only a 6-year sentence?
Raleigh, North Carolina. American white racists on the march earlier this year. At this demonstration, white power leaders mix with neo-Nazis under the leadership of the National Democratic Front, sister organisation to the National Front in Britain.
So, here we are again. Each time the system knocks us down, we rise up again. Stronger than before.
Gary Gallo is leader of the National Democratic Front. Since 1985, he's been visiting Britain, helping Nick Griffin remodel the National Front, creating a clandestine structure of small cells. The new National Front has been drawn to his blueprint. Lenny Zeskind, a leading American authority on the extreme right, monitors the National Democratic Front. He believes the Gallo-Griffin axis represents a unique threat on both sides of the Atlantic.
The new bright, and I emphasize this kind of bright young leadership of the National Front, of the National Democratic Front in the United States, has a great deal to learn from the British and they are consciously copying the ideology of the British. On the other hand, there's no white racist movement in the world that has as much experience with paramilitary violence and the use of weapons and the wide availability of explosives and weapons as the white supremacist movement in the United States.
Well, I don't know about Gary Gallo. I mean...
But he did spend some time with you.
With me?
With the National Front Directorate.
Well, no, I don't think he spent any time with us. I mean, the point is that he visited Britain, and for a short time he had contact with us. But as I say, we have contact with anyone who wants to come and speak to us, we will speak to see if there is common ground.
Well, in his own words, I've got a letter here from Gallo, written on National Democratic Front stationery, which he says, the National Front of Britain is now the leading national revolutionary movement in Europe. I trained with the National Front and maintained close ties with it. The third way ideology that the National Front adopted beginning in 1983 was in fact largely drawn from the teachings of a young man named Roberto Fiore, who has been living in exile in London since 1980. So it's clear that Gallo regards Fiore and the National Front in Britain as the model that he wants to follow.
For 20 years, National Front supporters have followed their leaders to the cenotaph to lay a wreath on Remembrance Day. This year, the political soldiers have abandoned the tradition, fearing police surveillance.
The National Front is no longer a political party as we normally recognize one. It's become effectively a proto-terrorist organization. Possibly not against the state in the short run, but certainly against opponents and individuals. And I think in the long run there are very strong reasons to think that it's systematic violence against the state, the basic overthrow of the British state.
The ideology driving this revolution will be drawn not from Britain, but from European neo-fascists and white supremacists in America.
I think one of the things that's important to understand about these white supremacist organizations is that they have both a public face on the one hand and a private face on the other. And the public face attempts to maintain a certain respectability. They talk about the fact that they're not white supremacists, they're just white civil rights activists, that they don't hate black people, that they just love white people. And it's a duality that allows them to exist and draw in new members on the one hand, but really carry out their most gruesome goals on the other.
As the political soldiers move ever further underground, the question is, where and when will they resurface?
They will now resort to terrorism. They will now justify terrorism. And, you know, terrorism, it's a matter of degree. They haven't reached sophisticated levels yet. They will, given the chance. They will. It's part of the strategy to help to bring about chaos as quickly as possible. Out of the ashes, the phoenix will rise. Common sense. No ashes, no phoenix. So those ashes must be created. Society must be destroyed. They are the enemies of organized society.
In August 1989, on the weekend before the 50th anniversary of the beginning of World War II, a synagogue in Richmond, BC was spray-painted with swastikas and Nazi slogans. Some of the worshippers who discovered the desecration were survivors of the Holocaust and had lost families and other relatives in the Nazi death camps. They, of course, were horrified and sickened. It was the third time that synagogue had been attacked in the preceding 12 months. Many of us may dismiss this sort of thing as the thoughtless and random behavior of a few young hooligans, kids who don't know any better, who will soon outgrow such childish pranks. Chances are the perpetrators were not kids. They knew exactly what they were doing, had done it before, and will do it again, in the name of defending Christianity. We should all be horrified and sickened, and perhaps a bit angry. On the next Cross Currents, we get a very different perspective on civil liberties and human rights. It's a film called Beau Pas, and it's an extraordinary documentary about the turmoil engulfing the black townships of South Africa. The film incorporates sequences from a brilliant play performed by 3 black South Africans, intercut with documentary footage from the streets and alleys. It dramatically portrays the complex conflict between the black police who must enforce the laws of apartheid and the blacks who violently oppose it. The play revolves around a career policeman, a black, his student activist son, and a brother from the countryside. Bopa, the word means arrest, is an utterly compelling integration of theater and documentary film. It has won a number of awards, and it's narrated by Sidney Poitier. Here's a preview.
In South Africa, the number of blacks living below subsistence level is nearly 10 million. Unemployment is extremely high. It is the police force that offers one of the few opportunities for a secure job. Nearly half of the police force is black.
That force must be correct, disciplined, and most important, within the law. Right. You must remember the force which you apply will have an influence on the force which will be applied in the future. You must not aggravate that situation.
In training, police cadets are taught a version of the law that is quite different from the reality of police conduct.
Did you want me to be a policeman? Just to come and run around the townships, shooting small little children? Look how he talks to his superiors. Captain Buta, where am I? I come from very far. I came to Joburg to look for work, and your policeman arrested me and put me in jail for sweet nothing, for pasafela. And today you want me to pick up a gun and go into the township and shoot small school children. Is this how you serve and protect your police force? I think your police force is sick. What? Your police force is sick. You don't know. Policeman of no policeman, arrest Bopa.
Bopa, on the next episode of Cross Currents. Many of the films on Cross Currents involve international events and situations that are the result of complex historical and political processes. Understanding these as current events and the significance of what one reads and sees in the news each day is a lot easier if one knows some of this background. For Cross Currents viewers, I've prepared a series of guides which provide a brief but fairly comprehensive background to many of our film subjects, and I think you'll find them interesting. I can tell you that preparing them is fascinating. For Cross Currents, I'm Jim Carney. Good night.
Viewers' guides for each program in the Cross Currents series are available at a cost of $3 each or $25 for the full set of 10. You can obtain your guides by writing to The Knowledge Bookstore, Post Office Box 94,000, Richmond, BC, V6Y2A2. If you prefer, you can phone the bookstore at one of these numbers, 660-2190, or toll-free 1-800-663-9711. And you can charge the order to your Visa or MasterCard. Once again, the cost of these informative guides is $3 each or $25 for the set of 10. Order yours now.